Hello, thank you that came today. Today we're happy to have with us Aristotle Kallis, who is Professor of Modern and Contemporary History at the School of Humanities at the Keele University. And he will give a talk on the banality of fascism. I don't have anything else to add, so the floor is yours.
Introductions, one way or another. Yeah, it wasn't very. Anyway, thank you very much for coming in a sort of post-celebratory spirit of the holidays. Sort of a little bit of more of a somber note today, but it doesn't matter. I mean, you know, that's the thing. Thank you for introducing me. Thank you for inviting me. I said yesterday that I would start with a disclaimer. I am a historian of sorts. Okay, I've never felt particularly happy in that label. But if I had to choose one, that would be it. I never really trusted history, especially as a field, as a cognitive epistemic field. But I like it. I always liked it. I think it's something that provides depth to the present in which we live more than anything else. I have no illusions, as I'm sure you don't, that we do history, we learn history, we study history, we research history in order to to learn from the past. Absolutely not. But obviously, I'm going to try and make a point that this past is useful in one way or another. From my own point of view, I have to say that I find something very reassuring in knowing that I, today, am not the first or the only one in history to have been going through all these trials and tribulations, going through all these dilemmas that we're talking about and you have been talking about in this series. And something also quite reassuring in the notion that humans don't change that much. Okay? Part of the narrative of history in the 19th century was that it could actually contribute to those narratives of progress, civilization, and so on and so forth. It didn't, not because it failed in itself, probably it did, but because it couldn't. It's a very big ask from it. So, for all these reasons, I'm probably a terrible speaker for this series, but you have to blame the organizers for this, not myself so much. So this is the thing. But let me tell you what I'm trying to do today. Okay, so here's my little academic stall, as it were. I'm a historian of fascism, of historical fascism. For many years, I went purist. I thought that fascism is a historical category. It makes sense in a particular context, of interwar Europe, and it is inappropriate in one way or another to talk about it post-1945. So consider this a sort of young academics' attempt to define the field and try to fight the disciplinary battles against political scientists who were using the term, sociologists who were using the term, and so on and so forth. So when over the years, I kind of mellowed, and I was attracted to the idea that there is a discourse about fascism in a contemporary setting. I remember immediately afterwards, after Donald Trump was elected, I was asked to write an article along with others, and I said, no, I'm not going to do it. But it was there. Something has changed in that respect. So over the last years, I have been drawn more and more into this discussion. And I remember very vividly, I was in Bulgaria at the time, in the middle of COVID, and as I was on the plane flying to the UK, I was looking at the news. Literally, the plane was accelerating on the runway, and I heard the news. I read the news that Trump supporters had breached the Capitol. Of course, I had to switch off my phone. And for 3.5 hours, I was pondering the world that I'm going to encounter when I switched on my phone when I landed. These 3.5 hours, complete blockout, okay? And I thought, what would be? Of course, the world didn't come to an end, but only just. And I was amused and perturbed by the narratives afterwards that it was the strength of American democracy, not more than anything else, that somehow defended from extremism. Then, a few days ago, we watched, of course, almost to the day, what happened in Brasilia. And, you know, history repeating or not, it doesn't matter in that respect. My entry point into this discussion is not so much the radical right, it's not so much the neo-fascists, it's not so much the alt-right. It's the discussion about what feeds the 48% of the Americans who in 2020 go out in the polls to vote affirmatively for Trump. Or the 49.1% of the people who go for a second time to vote affirmatively for somebody like Bolsonaro. And Meloni, and whoever, you know, there's so many of those people in that respect. So, who are these people? Why do they do it? What attracts them to it? Also, disconcertingly to me, why do I not know them? Where are they? Who are they? Why do I not encounter them that much? It's kind of fairly troubling questions in that respect. So, I mean, historians of fascism call these people ordinary people. Okay, Christopher Browning, when he was writing about the Holocaust and he was trying to understand the motives of the Einsatzgruppen soldiers, you know, he didn't encounter monsters. He encountered mostly ordinary people who are going through all these things. Fast forward a few years. 1961, Adolf Eichmann is put on trial in Jerusalem, and Hannah Arendt is in the audience. She has convinced New Yorker, of course, to send her as a observer. And you know the story. I'm not going to patronizing you, but I'm trying basically to justify myself for using banality, which is such a cheap trope in this discussion. But you know, this kind of thing. And Arendt, amongst the number of things she said prior to publishing the book, in one of her reports, says, and I quote, "Despite all the efforts of the prosecution, everybody could see that this man, Eichmann, was not a monster, but it was difficult indeed not to suspect that he was a clown." Okay? I mean, you know that the rest of the story most likely she got into unimaginable trouble that nearly wrecked her career for years and years and years. But when she got some time to reflect on her experience in Jerusalem, but also on the criticisms, I don't know whether you can read it. Yes, you probably can. I'm always very ambiguous about putting text on slides because I know now I can say anything because you're reading the slides, but you know, it's fine. You can see this. You can read this quote. Similar theme, but for me the interesting thing is the deeds were monstrous. There's no discussion about this. There's no banality there. There's no triviality. Okay, but the doer was quite ordinary. So again, we go into this discussion, and of course, this discussion, as I said, relates to all the big primes of the 20th century, supporters of fascism, supporters and contributors to the Holocaust, and so on and so forth. If we sort of project a little bit this discussion about the extremity of the deeds, but the ordinariness of the thought that underpins them, We're not that far away, of course, I'm just trying again, from what the two examples that I used earlier on. And of course, because I live in Britain, I have to speak about the trauma that I went through, okay, which is the 2016 referendum, what preceded it more than the electoral results per se. And it's the curse of this 52-48, 59, 51-49, 50-50, and so on and so forth. So, starting from this kind of overview of this experience, I go back to my core subject, which, as I said, is fascism. And I'm trying to say that there's nothing exceptional about the building blocks of this. The exceptionality comes later, and I'm going to talk about this. But if you think about how historians, particularly after 1945, trying to explain fascism, Friedrich Meinecke, for example, said it's some kind of malaise, people were infected. Benedetto Croce spoke about the parenthesis of civilization, okay? Norbert Elias spoke about the kind of decivilizing hiccup in a civilizing narrative, and so on and so forth. It was, as I will try and argue, not its extremity, not its radicality per se, but quite the opposite, its ordinariness, its banality, that made it so appealing to so many in so many countries so quickly. I'm talking about historic fascism here, but hopefully towards the end I'm going to project this discussion forward in that respect. So, exceptionalism on the one hand, banality on the other. We're used to talking about fascism in exceptional terms. We find it counterintuitive or shocking or unacceptable to talk about it as something that may be described in terms that relate to banality in that respect. So, what am I going to do? I'm going to give you like the convention is. I don't know why this thing came up. As you can see, I had a different picture, but the Century magazine 1921, maybe it's a very important text that I accidentally came up with in this presentation. Look to the left, okay? Fascism as extraordinary versus fascism banality. That concept of banality needs a little bit of unpacking, okay? And I will try and briefly do. And then I'm going to reflect on why I think not only fascism is banal, but why it ought to be analyzed in historic as well as in contemporary settings as something that is fed by this banality, as something that is supercharged by this banality, as something that is made attractive and appealing because of this banality. Usually when I try to explain to my students the notion of common sense, I need to spend about 2 weeks because the first thing I need to do is to introduce Gramsci because they've never heard, no concept, no context, and so on and so forth. So I don't have to do it today, but I'm going to refer to this a little bit towards the end when I'm talking about my final point, what I call the uneven struggle against this fascism then and now in many ways. So, blank screen. Right, yeah. So, a little over 100 years ago, I mean, we are now in peak anniversary season, fascist historians, 1922. We'll find another one this year, and so on. Fascism meant nothing. The word meant nothing. It had no content linguistically. The signifier and the signified didn't meet at all, are signified today. Within a very, very short period of time, and this is part of the extraordinariness of fascism, he graduated into a formidable trope. First in Italy, of course, but very soon across. And it's the story of diffusion that I always find very, very interesting. So when we talk about this era of fascism, sort of 1922 to 1945, we talk of superlatives. The extreme ideology of fascism, the extreme performance of fascism, the extreme actions of fascism, the extreme violence of fascism, the extreme critique of fascism on not only the left, not only the notion of revolutionary socialism, but also of liberalism. And I'm not saying it's the same, but it was a sort of extreme nature of that critique. So we talk about it in those terms, and it makes sense, of course, because of all these things that make fascism such a big chapter in the darkest histories of the 20th century. And because of historians far more important than me, who have worked in previous decades, we know much more now about this fascism. We understand it a bit better, we know it a bit better. We have taken it on the scientific table, if you like, and we have dissected it. And yet, for all these nuances of research, fascism remains a monster and a beast, something we always use to refer to as out there. Now, I know that this doesn't apply to most, stroke all, of those present today, but in historical terms, there is still a very radical rupture between, I got into a lot of trouble with one of my friends in one of the seminars, between mainstream and fascism. Okay, the mainstream of the interwar period and fascism. It's kind of always this sort of exceptionalism behind it, a kind of othering of fascism in that respect. Was it? Well, sorry, I should have said like this. And part of the story, by the way, this is why I put it there, is the big question mark that historians always underline, and that why did fascism not only succeed in Italy? Okay, these things happen on a country-by-country basis. Italy elected Meloni, so you could say it happened in Italy, but it hasn't happened somewhere else. But its diffusion so quickly, as I said, so widely, so profoundly. And a lot of historians still find that very surprising, very exceptional. It was something really exceptional in fascism, spreading so quickly and gaining ground so quickly and so widely. And I find that quite strange in many ways. So I think historians of fascism, when they decided to become serious about this fascism, they came up with this trope, which is a very maligned and misunderstood trope, the notion of methodological empathy. I put it there we go, we were discussing about Roger Griffin just before. When you talk about methodological empathy when it comes to fascism, when you try and take fascism seriously, when you study the text and when you engage with the speech acts and when you take the symbols seriously and the performative aspect seriously, you run in trouble in two ways. On the one hand, people can accuse you that you give it too much attention. You give it more worth than it's actually due in that respect. And you normalize it by talking about it, and by talking about it with this kind of, the emphasis is on methodological, not on empathy. People tend to lock on the empathy thing, and of course that becomes a recipe for disaster. But on the other hand, historians of fascism are trying to say something else, and this is something also we're discussing earlier on, that rather than seeing different things in different countries and say, oh, they are different. Recently we edited a special issue on am I allowed to talk about this? Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, on interwar Greece, and of course on the Metaxas regime. And most historians of fascism will not talk about Metaxas as fascist. It's some kind of, of course not. Because why? Because talking about Metaxas or Franco or all these other people as fascist is trivializing, banalizing fascism. Is cheapening it. We have a little baby there, which we have over-defined, and we cherish it against all kind of miscegenations, from authoritarianism, from conservatism, from all these kind of things. We don't want to go there at all. So, on the one hand, normalization. On the other hand, trivialization. These are the two main, if you like, criticisms in that respect. And then, of course, there is the chapter of the diffusion. I put these two side by side, these two graphs side by side, because on the left there is a pretty straightforward image of the so-called authoritarian half of Europe in the 1920s and 30s. So take southern, take eastern, take central, but not. It's a nice, comforting narrative for Western Europe, isn't it? But not Western and Northern Europe, which resisted because of the alleged robustness of its democratic institutions. But cue the image on the left. Try and find two symbols there that look similar. Some of these people define themselves as fascist in the name. Some of them don't, but they express their admiration to Mussolini and they choose a number of things. Every single sign is different. And that tells us the other story. Not only that it spread, but it spread and it was translated in different settings. So people saw something in all these countries, but instead of copying it, one of the criticisms of my colleagues when I'm talking about let's open up this discussion of fascism, chronologically in terms of ideas, is that I was trying to say something. One of those main criticisms is that by opening up this discussion, we are losing the core of that particular phenomenon, or we are diluting the term of fascism in that respect. What you see here is how each and every one of those operators is not just mimicking what they see. They become translators, and translators are agents. They're not just intermediators, they're producers. And of course, you can see the local color, if you like, in all these different varieties in many ways. So, let's talk a bit about this banality. So when I talk about banalization, of course, we have to talk a little bit about this term because I need to justify my use of it. So I was about to say to us in the room, but of course that's not true because there is an inscription of this event that is far from us in this room, but I'm going to say it as if I didn't know. Of course, there is a little bit of a provocation because using this word, but my intention is not to delve into the discussion that surrounded Arendt's use of banal. Okay, it's if you like, just an entry point into it, a different point. My point is somewhat different, and I'm quoting. You probably have. I don't know whether anybody has come across this historian. In many ways, he's my hero, and I don't agree with anything he's saying. Has anyone come across him? I mean, he came up with this idea of cliodynamics. Clio as in the muse, the ancient Greek muse. Why is he my hero? Because I can't remember his original field. He was sort of ecology and scientific ecology, and at some point he gave it up mid-career, and he said, I always loved history, so I'm going to be history. And his point was, of course he's a scientist, that history is the last discipline to use scientific principles. So he said, I'm going to do it. So he came up with this clear dynamic. So I find this incredibly bold. But he has a point, and I always like this quote. Historians focus on the outliers. We focus on the specific. We focus on the idiosyncratic. We focus on the extraordinary, on the sensational, on the nice story, of course, because these are the interesting things in so many ways. But his point is that sometimes by focusing on those outliers, we miss the broader trends. So what feeds those things, for example? What underpins them? What makes them possible? The legacy that we leave afterwards. And it's understandable that we're enthralled to the spectacular, but at the same time, that point is interesting even in this discussion, because I am trying to use the word banality to talk about these grander trends, if you like. And I suppose my point briefly with regard to this is that this matters. It matters in the context of historic fascism, and it matters in every discussion about the radical nationalist right before, during, and after the interwar period, including today. Okay? That the political, the intellectual, and the cultural hegemonic frameworks that rendered something like fascism, if you like, ordinary, normal, acceptable, untroubling, appealing, and so on, and reassuring, remain very much in place. They survived, of course, 1945. They remained barely untouched. I'm not going to say completely untouched because that's not true. They have been flexing their muscles post 1945. And in my point, they predated fascism as well. And why not talk about something like normalization? Now, this is more of a self-criticism. I have spoken a lot about the normalization of the radical right in the contemporary setting. I have come to regret this because normalization is a process. You normalize something that is not so normal. I think there's nothing to normalize. Again, we're not talking about the deeds, we're talking about the building blocks, we're talking about the intellectual, the political, the cultural foundations. There's nothing to normalize, there's nothing that is abnormal and that needs to be normalized, and in that respect, I think the term is quite skewed and quite unhelpful in many ways. So, to refer to all this as banality, to me, reflects that kind of critique of the love of the exceptional, of the love of the something extreme, not part of the normalizing narrative, and so on and so forth. So here's where Arendt comes into this discussion, but as I said, I'm not going to delve into this at all. I'm just trying to say that it is a term that comes with baggage, and I'm aware of it, and I am not using it in that respect. However, I don't know whether you can see it. I wanted to quote a couple of things from Arendt. Focus on the bold elements. Okay, so talking about radical evil, and so it can spread like a fungus over the surface of the earth and lay waste the entire world. A little bit below, it was a very long quote, and I had to cut it. She talks about that fungus spreads, but only grows when it finds fertile soil. Okay, because everything can spread, but of course you need to keep it in that respect. So to find, you need this kind of friction between the spore of the fungus and the fertile soil that is going to nourish it, that is going to make it grow very, very fast. And this kind of trope of fungus to me is very interesting, of course, because it captures the idea of how something so extreme becomes acceptable, but also, as I said, why it becomes so internationalized, why it becomes so appealing to so many people across different settings. So, in what way can fascism be banal then, if its deeds and its expressions are anything but banal? Okay? Ask every historian of fascism to tell you, if you absolutely had to come up with one element that is at the core of fascism. Historians of fascism will disagree about everything, okay? Like most historians, but probably us a little bit more. So, on that, in response to that question, I think you'll probably get the same answer. As the one. And then, of course, they'll start saying but. Okay, that's the thing. Nationalism. Okay, so nationalism is the sort of foundational stone of this kind of thing. So, in many ways, for a historian of fascism, nationalism is the moisture on the ground, is that kind of fertile soil, if you like. Okay, and in order to answer the question as to why something that happened in Italy, and it was Italian oddity in 1922, and many people even barely noticed at the time, how this thing grew so quickly and spread so quickly and became translated so quickly, you need this kind of idea, you need this kind of more common fertile soil of a nationalist point of view. So, of course, we can exceptionalize nationalism, we can use superlatives, we call about ultranationalisms, we call about extreme nationalisms, hyper-nationalisms, and so on and so forth. But I do like, and here is sort of, I'm calling Michael Billig in that respect, his notion of banal nationalism. And he's not writing this book, of course, about fascism, if you don't know the book, about nationalism. I chose not the English version of it, but this, because for me it's much more interesting. If you see this kind of animal that is turning into roots, to me that's a very, very nice depiction of the essence of the book. And, sorry, this is a much longer quote, but as I said, I can probably not say very important things right now because you're reading the quote. I can just say that the sort of continual flagging, the banal reminding, the banal performance of this nationalism. 1995, that book, I mean, these were the heydays of globalization, okay? This was like the love story with the new myth of progress. So the last paragraph to me is very interesting because it comes at a time when it was not canonical necessarily to say something like this. Of course, the nation state is in decline and so on and so forth. That's what people say, but a reminder is necessary. Nationalism is still being reproduced. You can still call for ultimate sacrifices, and daily its symbols and assumptions are flagged. I don't know whether you've read the book or you remember the book. There's a very nice story in the book about somebody going into a barber shop in France and finding a magazine that has at its cover a photo from the parade of the Bastille Day, and there is a black soldier, I think he was a soldier, looking very, very shaken in a sort of ecstatic way in front of the flag. And he makes the point, what does the flag mean in the parade day versus what does it mean on a magazine lying on a barber shop when somebody is kind of flicking through it. So it's a very interesting argument in that respect. So for Billig, nationalism is inherently banal in that respect. So coming even closer to the ideas. Now I'm going to get into trouble for the next person I am quoting because I don't agree with everything. But when I read, I'm kind of apologizing, okay, for what comes afterwards. But when I read that book much later than it was written, I rejected it and never went back to it. It was not for me. I disagreed profoundly, and so on and so forth. So once you have got over the shock of seeing the name, just pay a little attention to the quote, okay? There we go. So I came clean right now. I mean, yeah, very problematic. Plus the book, of course, very, very problematic. I mean, extremism on the left, center, and right. So forget the extremism of the left. And that's why I quoted very, very carefully here, okay? So as not to offend anyone or myself for that matter. To me, the best thing is at the bottom. The social characteristics of the Nazi voter in pre-Hitler Germany and Austria, but also in Hitler Germany and Austria, resemble those of the liberals, much more so than those of the conservatives, and so on and so forth. Now, he calls it the extremism of the center. That's not a good term in so many ways. But there's an interesting underpinning to this idea that what feeds fascism is not the fringe and the extreme only, but also values that are very much at the center, depending on what you want to call it, the banality of everyday flagging of nationalism, the parts of the mainstream political culture, parts of the cultural canon, of the social canon, and so on and so forth. More interestingly, I did warn the organizers that I drink quite a lot of water. I know it doesn't look good on the video, but I'll say. More interestingly, George Mosse, who is one of the most important, low-key, however, is kind of less spectacular, but incredibly important historians of fascism. Again, sort of slightly big. Forget about it. Just focus on the second paragraph. It doesn't matter. I mean, this is the thing. He called fascism a scavenger. Okay. So essentially, he's trying to say that he's one of the people he's one of the historians, one of the first historians who said we should take fascism seriously as an ideology, as a political force, not as an outlier, but something that's deeply rooted in reproducible values at the mainstream of society. But rather than exceptionalizing, he said, but at the end of the day, fascism is a scavenger. So basically, it picks up this and that, Romanticism, liberalism, socialism, okay, whatever, Darwinism, modern technology, tradition and modernity, past and future, and so on and so forth. Too little attention has been paid to this scavenging because, of course, we focus on the sensational. Okay, that's fine. But in reality, all these fragments of the past were integrated into a coherent attitude towards life through the basic fascist nationalist myth. I find that very, very interesting. And a brief quote, you'll be relieved to hear, not on a slide. Alice Kaplan, who has written one of the very interesting books on the trope of banality in literature, talks about banality as something that is not necessarily trivial, but it's open to the use of the entire community, a common shared place. So it can mean this as well as trivial. Okay, so it's not just the pejorative meaning, but something much bigger. So in Mosse's idea of this banality, there is a fundamental conflict at the heart of fascism between the so-called revolutionary, the radical, if you like, and the traditional. So radical values, traditional values in many ways. And that is solved, he says, through the attitude towards the outsider. So Mosse says, and I quote without showing, while the bourgeois values were retained when facing the members of the community, of who we are, they could be totally rejected in the struggle for domination over the others. So that would be the exceptionalism, okay? So the bourgeois values remain, but we don't project them when it comes to the others. And of course, because fascism was rummaging in the area of traditional values and bourgeois values in that respect, it was, of course, I thought I had another one. It was, of course, a scavenger in that respect. I thought I had the other, trying to annex all that appealed to people before. So, an interesting idea, an interesting understanding of fascism by a historian who's trying to show that its strength is not its extremity, but its reassuring familiarity. The fact that people could easily click. Many people, some people, it doesn't matter, but not the write-offs only. Okay? Strikingly absent from this discussion, and I'm promising you I am also reflecting now forward as well. Strikingly absent from this discussion is a concept that I consider almost as important as nationalism when it comes to fascism, and that is sovereignty. Okay? I use this illustration from one of the elections. 1933, the first elections after Hitler came to power. As you can see, is I don't know how you describe this, the rolling swastika breaking the chains of the Versailles Treaty over Germany. And I think sovereignty is one of the sort of understudied areas of fascist ideology and narrative, because essentially here is a fundamental intoxicating promise. The promise of giving agency to people who, rightly or wrongly, feel deprived of the power to make history. Even worse, when it comes to this setting, of people who feel that they had been robbed of that agency by conspirators and so on and so forth. So the promise of restoring, redeeming that agency as a precondition for a rebirth, for future greatness, for redressing the moral injustices of the past and so on and so forth, is a pretty powerful, emotively proposition in many ways. In the particular context of the interwar period, that message comes at a moment when something else is happening. I call it, for want of a better term, the Internationalist Moment. And I'm using the term with quite a lot of liberty, but I'm not talking about what is happening for the internationalists. I'm talking about how this is perceived by everything else. So we have quite a lot of internationalist projects at the time. I know this is a very, very weird curation of illustrations. Okay, so let me explain to you. Of course, 1917. Okay, what happens after 1917 feeds this kind of idea that this is now an era of internationalism. This is now something that is going to that is spreading and subsuming the old cherished nations of the time. On the other hand, the liberals are up for a different project of internationalism in their own eyes. When they set up institutional frameworks, for example, the League of Nations and so on and so forth, that essentially are understood at the time as an incursion into the traditional sovereignty of the states. So, imagine the story, and I didn't know that story very well, but I wrote about it a couple of years ago, an article. All the new states that were created in 1919, most of them were actually dragged to Paris to sign the treaties that gave them their rewards, the states, the territories, or whatever, on condition that they accepted liberal constitutions, Jewish emancipation, minority treaties, coming out of nowhere in 1919, no roots, no discursive context to latch on, okay? And of course, the people who go there, who incidentally, most of them are liberals or liberal conservatives, people who you do not associate with the extreme, are appalled. They don't want to sign it. They decree it, but of course, here it comes, sign it, get your nation, get your state or not. They do 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the line, they turn their backs to it, they change this completely. And not only that, then the fascists very cunningly turn this all into a hyper-conspiracy. The conspiracy of internationalists, kind of echoing Lipset here, no. Left and right, so on the one hand the plutocrats, on the other hand the Bolsheviks, and of course every other internationalist that come into this, who are doing exactly what? They are enslaving the nations, they're robbing them of their agency to be historical agents and so on and so forth. So the fascist project is a project of redemption. Nothing more. The passion, fine, is extreme, but the actual project is redress. Not very much more than this. On my clock, I've got about 15 to 20 minutes. Is that right? Okay, right. So, on the one hand, the feeding of fascism from nationalism. What a great, kind of head start for a new ideology. Yes, fascism came out of nowhere in 1919 and meant nothing, but when you latch onto something as powerful, as pervasive, as seeping into the ordinariness of life as nationalism, you get this. On the other hand, the narrative of injustice, crisis, anxiety, fear, you call it whatever you like, and the promise of restoring that agency. That is a pretty strong basis in that respect. So, when I was, I talk to this, I make my speech a little bit later, so thankfully I had a little bit of a sneak preview of other speakers in many ways. So a number of names crop up and a number of things crop up, and you say, okay, that's great. At least I can latch on to something else as well in that respect. So here is my Gramscian moment after my brief internationalist moment in many ways. And again, as I said, I'm not going to delve into it per se, but I'm going to quote, sort of fairly long quote, Stuart Halls. Who have I? Yeah, no, correctly, yeah. It's a blog. I think it appeared in Verso. I can't remember exactly, but I always use it in my class, and I try to tell my British students what they think about it. Even to them, even Thatcher is exotic. So it's something out there. History with a capital H. So he's referring about Gramsci, and he's projecting that discussion on British society and Thatcherism. He's writing this in the wake of Corbyn's defeat in 2017, which in contrast to many other, to some anyway, commentators of the left in Britain at the time, he sees as a crushing defeat. That much of the narrative in 2017 was that Jeremy Corbyn did much better than we feared. So, still defeat, but it was this kind of idea. He's writing this, also projecting about why this happened in many ways, and he's quoting extensively from Common Sense. But in it, there is of course the quote from the prison notebooks, when Gramsci is reflecting on his sort of understanding of the common sense and the good sense in many ways. And basically, it's the last. Sorry, I'm just looking again of Thatcherism. But actually, he goes on and he says, and there's a quote further down that says, there's a bit of Thatcherism lives in every one of us. Okay, so he's obviously talking to an audience in many ways. When I study the 1930s, I always encounter this not socialist, absolutely not, but the liberal bafflement with the rise of fascism. There is a genuine disbelief. Why is this happening? Why is it spreading? Why is this taking hold? And of course, it's such a catastrophic defeat, if you like, for liberalism as well, for that international, lofty liberalism of the 1920s, that the wave of dictatorship that engulfs Europe is fundamental. Here is you can see the colors, but also the dates, and of course things are flashing on and off. There is a brief moment in 1919 where everything is grey, and blue is democracy. But of course, if you look at the dates, this indicates the dates of authoritarian transformation of this society. So by 1939, nothing happens. And of course, you have the Greeces and the Spains of Europe that are flashing on and off all the time in many ways. So parliamentary democracy was in full retreat in the 1930s, but we still, the liberals at the time were baffled as to why this is happening. In Europe, as well as in other parts of the world. And we know the rest of the story. The minority treaties that they had signed went. The League of Nations went. Trade unions were broken in most countries, not only in the countries where fascism took power, but in many other countries by many governments that span the spectrum from liberals to the conservatives to the authoritarian and so on and so forth. And part of me is actually thinking, why this bafflement? So I'm referring to Stuart Halls' comment earlier on, which is saying, we are perplexed about this kind of resilience of Thatcherism as some kind of little spore in every one of us. And I'm thinking, who on earth thought that this arrangement, and I'm talking about the liberal utopia here of the 1920s, could survive? When it was seen as being imposed from above, when it was seen as going against the grain of the cherished values, of the totems, if you like, and so on. So who on earth thought that this had good chances that the normal, if you like, scenario would be that this would actually stay? And of course, Europe imploded, and this is the end of the interwar story. So the promise of undoing the loss of sovereignty to the nation, to the heart of the historical engine, if you like, is very powerful. Was powerful, still is powerful. I don't know whether you watched, as I said, I live in Britain. A few days ago, the leader of the Labour opposition in Britain referred to empowering local communities in the UK as a sort of strengthening local democracy. I don't know whether you read the story, which basically he used Take Back Control, which was the winning formula for the Brexit referendum in 2016. I mean, a lot of work had happened, had a lot of research has happened afterwards, and found that this particular slogan was probably a turning point. It was a point when a lot of people latched on to something familiar, reassuring, and positive. Take agency, back, redress, control power. What's not to like? And of course, who is we? We is the community, we is the historic community, we is a purified, redeemed community. It excludes people, it excludes the others of whatever sort, and this is the idea. So this kind of mixture of nationalism on the one hand and sovereigntism on the other is the most potent fertile soil. And I normally resist the temptation to say, look at the 1920s, look at the 1930s and everything. No, I can say that because technically the fundamental tropes that underpin this have not been particularly revisited. We live still in a world in which sovereignty is such a cherished emotional trope, in which nationalism is banal in every sense of the word. And this is what also makes the message easily translatable from place to place, from culture to culture. Historians of fascism have got trouble explaining why fascism was anti-clerical in one country, no, and clerical in another, religious in another. Why it's anti-Semitism in one country, anti-Semitic in one country, and anti-Serb or anti-whatever in the other, and everything. So, these things don't go together. No, of course they don't go together, but the main premise here is that when fascism troubles, it gets translated, and when it gets translated and as a scavenger it's reassembled on the basis of the national tropes, it takes the forms of these tropes. And this is precisely why it is translated and why it becomes appealing, even if it's different to the original, into inverted commas, that is happening something else in many ways. So the fascists then and since invest themselves in that cloak of familiarity, of ordinariness, of banality, if you like. They spoke of the familiar we, which makes sense to a lot of people because it's something that has been reproduced without much critique, without much engagement. They spoke about familiar others, those others being construed on national, racial, cultural, political, whatever grounds. They glorify the former, they demonize the latter. This is the extremity of fascism, but the fundamental is the same. They promise victory, they promise redemption, they promise an overcoming of the crisis, they promise transcendence. And they promise that transcendence in familiar terms, in terms that a lot of people still find not particularly difficult to engage with, to accept. Or, if you like, even if they don't find them particularly untroubling in normal times, in times of crisis, they have to, because the choices are much more stark in many ways. So, I'm going to finish with this. Just put a little bit of I'm going to refer to a couple of quotes in order to justify the title at the top. So I read this book by Gary Haradas. I don't know whether you've read it or you've read about it. It's a very interesting slight change of direction in his thought about how to engage with extremism, with racism, and so on. So one of his quotes, I don't know whether I've put it here, in an interview, he doesn't use it exactly with those terms in a book, and he doesn't refer to the historical fascists that I study mostly. So the fascists are better at politics. I'm not sure I agree with this. There is little that is inherently wrong in anti-fascist politics, or less good in his own ideas, or less effective in terms of the performance of it. But I'm going to again go really rogue and quote somebody completely different just to make my point in response, Jared Heradas. I mean, postmodernism. There we go. Wilhelm Reich. The appeal of those details of everyday life. He's talking about fascism, okay? So there you go. The psychology of fascism is understood and used by the fascists much more successfully than are the thousands of revolutionary rallies and leaflets by the workers' movement. That's why he says, okay, obviously in a very different historical period, okay, in a very different period in that respect, but I suppose there is a little bit of an echo of this kind of idea that, what is more effective? It's this, in many ways. I would say I am not entirely true. I'm not entirely convinced. I don't find it particularly true. I just think that the politics of fascism enjoys an unfair advantage. The narrative that in many ways is reproduced on the banal level is identifiable because it is latching on to banal values, traditional values, values that are reproduced over decades, over centuries, and so on and so forth. It does not ask for an intellectual transcendence. It does not ask for a jump. It's something that is there, familiar, almost uncritically considered before in many ways. And that's why I quoted earlier Stuart Hall in many ways, that kind of bit of Thatcherism in many ways. So in that respect, the hegemonic struggle that at least one previous speaker mentioned as a way forward, okay, is obviously the way forward for me, but it's also an uneven one. It's an uneven game. And I've always said that, in the talking about my subject in the 1920s and 30s, there is no unlikely success of fascism. There is nothing unlikely about the success of fascism. Not of fascism as it was, but of something like fascism in the circumstance of the 1920s and 1930s in many countries, and so on and so forth. So, in this crucial respect, the story of interwar fascism is much closer to current predicaments than we would like to think. Not because we should see fascists everywhere, not because we should brand fascists everywhere necessarily, but because those fascists of the yesteryear, if you like, fed from the sheer banality of the fundamentals that they conjured up, their fundamentals that have survived, that are reproduced, that are still around today. I maintain that the field of struggle, of that hegemonic struggle, is deep, is skewed, that the banality of fascism is not about normalization. I feel very strongly, and I'm actually self-critical here, as I said, it's not about normalization. It doesn't even require that much effort in that respect. And all these things should be a useful reminder of the challenge of that struggle when we're faced with something like this. The stakes are not just high, but the odds are a bit skewed, if you like, in that respect. And that's why, to end on a slightly more positive note, an optimistic note, every victory, small or large, if you like, revolutionary or incremental, must be cherished as a little bit of an unlikely triumph. But unless the attention is drawn to these fundamentals, and unless we break the vicious circle of the reproduction of those fundamentals at a hegemonic level, that game will continue to be skewed one way or another and uneven. Thank you.
Thank you for your great talk. I have many questions, but first of all, let's the audience speak and ask questions. Who wants to ask something? Please.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. Thanks. I was very fascinated by what you were saying about 1919, because it feels very, very familiar to what's actually happening today. As you know, we met yesterday and we talked to you about a seminar we had on the alt-right and the transformations of the far right today. And perhaps one of the main findings that actually separates the right for the far right is the extensive reliance on conspiracy theories. And the idea that an international order of things is threatening, something is happening, and the international aspect of that is very strong there as well. So I was very, do you see a resemblance there? Is it a permanent, could you actually talk about a permanent characteristic of fascism, or even a permanent characteristic of the far right, even before it assumed the form of historical fascism? But, this fear of an international order of things as something that is external and threatening and away from the community is there. Could we actually call this a fundamental characteristic?
Thank you. I totally agree. I don't think that conspiracies are a privilege of the far right. It's partly part of that kind of attraction to the spectacular. I can't remember where, but where I read it, but the liberal counter-argument, the liberal counter-conspiracy of the Russians after Trump, that there is a it could or it could not be. Like in all conspiracy theories, they could or could not be true. It doesn't matter though. It's a kind of displacement, and a very powerful displacement. Conspiracy theories are about far away. So there is this kind of idea, the somewhere versus the nowhere, if you like. They are about this kind of transfer of robbing of power. They are also about the secret aspect, the invisibility of it, and the suggestion that somehow we have uncovered this conspiracy is intoxicating as well. It's also part of that we have reclaimed, by finding the source, we have reclaimed as part of agency. But the answer is exactly the same, which is claw back. So there are all these people, and of course, the notion of an international conspiracy is a little bit of an empty signifier. Okay, you can project on it anything you like. There's a reason why Greece scores very highly in the wrong sense in all surveys of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, I would say, banal Islamophobia. and so on. So you project onto it something different, but the idea that somehow the national we or whatever, back and now, we have been robbed of that agency by devious international forces is very much there, and I think the right always we can let it go, yeah. The right always had the far right always had this proclivity towards conspiracy. I mean, if you think about again historical fascism, immediately one of the most powerful tropes was talking about Germany stabbed in the back. So somehow Germany was not defeated in the First World War; it was stabbed in the back by those internationalists and so on and so forth. Okay, so it doesn't surprise me that something like QAnon is so powerful, for example, in the United States, and it got traction essentially during the years of the pandemic, to the point that it's almost like a baffling diffusion of this conspiracy theory now. I'm not so familiar with the Greek scene of the alt-right, so I'm deferring to the knowledge of your project and your work. But I wonder how different the conspiracies of the Greek alt-right are in that respect.
They're actually quite similar. You don't have the QAnon in that sense, because that wouldn't work here. But the international order of things, the new order of things, is something very, very familiar. The great replacement theory is something that is extremely popular on the far right at the moment, and also to the point that it's articulated as such, not only on fringe organizations, but also on the political program of political parties who are going to run for the elections. For instance, the Bogdanos Latinopoulou Patrida refers, when it analyzes the demographic issue that plagues Greece at the moment, as part of the great replacement theory, where some obscure forces are trying to exterminate the nation, so no one is giving birth to kids, and Muslims are going to come and take over. So that's another one which I think is very similar. It's not as much. The U.S. is a bit different in the sense that they didn't have to face the refugee crisis as Europe did. So there it's a bit different. But there is a lot of overlap in that sense. I am under the impression that, I don't know, maybe you could answer that better than I do. I am under the impression that the far right is getting internationalized itself in a very intense way, in a way that it was not before.
The far right, historical or not, has always been internationalizing. In fact, without trying to push what I was saying earlier on too much here, I would say that it's interesting. Historians of fascism always say, how did something that glorifies nationalism become internationalist? Okay, so it's one of those things. And I'm saying there's little contradiction. There's no either or there. Okay, the internationalism of the anti-Semites in the 19th and 20th century could be completely different, could hate each other, but at the same time they have a lingua franca, which is the demonization of the Jew, demonization of the Bolsheviks, demonization of the New Order, and so on and so forth. Yes, this kind of tropes make something like fascism supremely internationalizable. It shouldn't surprise us. And it shouldn't surprise us also that as it becomes internationalized, the networks come together one way or another, and this today much easier, in the period that I'm studying, people had to physically travel to go. Stories of people starting from Stockholm to go to Nuremberg to attend the Nazi Party rally, for example, had to travel for 4 days to get there. Of course, today, this kind of informal network, one way or another, happens in a very banal way, in many ways. But it should come as no surprise, and nor should it come as a surprise, that in spite of this contact, they're still very different. So the conspiracy of the international in the United States means something completely different to what it means in Hungary, which is a great case study about all of the things that I was trying to talk about today and so many others. Over the summer, I can't remember, in August, I think, Orban gave this infamous speech, which is a textbook of the continuity of the tropes about nationalism, about othering, about conspiracy, about internationalism, about the enemy, about the Jews, of course, in this particular setting, about the Muslims, everything. It's almost like a manufactured text by the most incredible algorithm, and yet it was written and delivered live by a human being who happens to be leader of Hungary for the fourth time? I've lost count now how many times he has been elected. Yeah, absolutely.
The microphone to Yorgos.
Does this work? Okay. Thank you. Great talk, very intriguing. I would like to go back to some of your points in the beginning about this interest to find out what is it that is fueling this kind of resurgence of something that we could call fascist or related to fascist. I'm still quite skeptical about that and all the kind of different labels that are emerging. However, I'm fully on board with most of the points. The thing that still intrigues me is this relationship between the agency of political elites with the grassroots, and there's an interplay here. So on the one hand, we have this kind of interpretations that political elites are always vote-seeking and stuff in the political science jargon, following trends that can be observed in the grassroots in society. On the other hand, we have the kind of more Gramscian interpretations about meaning-making and about hegemony and so on. So in the end, I would like to push you to elaborate a bit further on what is at play here in this kind of banal fascism, or even if we could think of kind of more dynamic of the banalization of fascism, not a very good term, but if we could think about something like that, and what is the role of political elite agency in particular. And in this sense, I would like, in fact, to defend some of your older writings on normalization and some other ones on the mainstreaming on the far end. I'm sure that you're familiar with those. And maybe I like more the notion of mainstreaming, but in a sense, I think that there is still value in this, in the sense that if we understand normalization and mainstreaming as a kind of process through which ideas and values and policies and so on and behaviors that were once in the margins are brought back again into the center, and in the sense that even some politicians believed in them. They were ashamed to admit it. Ruth Wodak has written a brilliant book about this, and she's talking about the shameless normalization of the far right. Before there was some kind of shame in defending certain ideas, and I think that this is quite important. Whether we call it normalization, mainstream, something that we like better, there's still value in it, because it puts the focus on what political elites are actually doing there. And I think this is quite important. So I would like to push you to talk a bit more towards that direction, if that's okay.
The push is very welcome, I said. Thank you very much for this. Now, it's really interesting. About a year ago, I was doing something that a lot of academics in the UK, and I think sadly internationally, have to do every now and then, not because they necessarily want to do it, but because their manager tells them that it's time to do it, which is to apply for a grant. I was writing the proposal. I was playing with these words. Now, I totally agree with you. I could almost hear my attempt to define the two terms in the introduction of that grant proposal. To me, the two terms are not interchangeable. And I suppose that's what I was trying to say here. To be self-critical of my own use of normalization and mainstreaming. And I started with mainstreaming, and I have to blame a colleague of mine who is somebody who is part of the tradition that you just mentioned earlier, for putting me into this notion of normalization, which really set me alight. I thought, okay, that's really interesting. That's actually a less clunky way. Mainstreaming is not a very nice, very interesting way, because at the end of the day, people can still question what is normal, but it's something that, again, to use the tropes from here, you can conceptualize. Okay, the mainstream you can't grasp. Okay, what is mainstream? What is its opposite? What does it include and everything? For me, the two terms are not the same. So the mainstreaming of fascism, or something like fascism back then and today, and so on and so forth. You talk about the agency of the political elite. Absolutely fundamental. On the discursive level, on the level of reproduction in terms of communication and so on and so forth, on the sort of ethical level of granting not just space but moral aura, if you like, to these views by rehearsing them in particular setting. For me, something can be normal, can be seen as normal in sort of broadly Foucauldian sense. Okay, I'm not trying to overspecify it, but can be normal without being mainstream. For me, the mainstream has more of the elite element that you mention quite a lot in this section. So the mainstreaming is something that can be masterminded through elite political agency. It can be done somewhat else, and it's a very important part of this discussion. So when we are discussing Islamophobia in a contemporary settings, I contribute to a volume, an annual, on the Islamophobia report in Europe, and the role of the political elites in the normalization, in the mainstreaming, as you put it, of that kind of Islamophobia is, if you take it away, it doesn't make sense. Okay, you can't just explore it in terms of structural racism and so on and so forth. This is a very important part of this, in my opinion anyway, of the interpretation, but you need the other one as well. So just very briefly, to give you an example of how I am thinking about these two terms, there is a mainstreaming project that is taking place in Europe after the end of the First World War, and globally as well, but and it's a mainstreaming project, of course, that doesn't involve the left, the revolutionary left, of course not. But it's a mainstreaming project that involves, from above, very much from above, that involves this kind of new tropes of, on the one hand, absolutely crazily, on the one hand, putting forward those liberal values of, as I said, minority protections and liberal constitutionalism and so on and so forth, and on the other hand, feeding the flames of nationalism. So this was the crazy idea behind the redrawing of the European map after the First World War. How can you talk about minority protection to a state that you have given the right to exist on the basis of national ethnic self-determination? It makes no sense. It's like playing with fire. It's like delivering those minorities to the beast that is going to consume them very, very soon, precisely because for them, this is the moment of their triumph, and they don't want to share it with those minorities and so on and so forth. But it's there. It has become mainstream. Suddenly, this narrative has been mainstream without necessarily being normalized. What is normal is to think about the nation as an ethnic, pure community. So the elites, on the one hand, are trying to push a particular project. It didn't work in the 1920s, not strangely, but it didn't work in the 1920s. Now, I do think that we need both sides of that story, because sometimes they're feeding each other in this sort of supply and demand cycle, but on the other hand, sometimes they are at odds. They are at odds. So we have canonical projects pushed through elites that are resisted, that are rejected. You used a metaphor like, I can't remember exactly, but you said they went along with something, but they really don't want to say the more extreme things, okay? So it's this kind of taboo notion. So there is a point of taboo whereby you feel that you can't cross that line, even if you really, really want to cross that line, okay, one way or another. And with a bit of a nudge, that thing comes to the fore. So I entirely agree with you. That's a very long-winded way to say that I agree with you. We need to talk about the role of political elites, mainstream political elites in this project. What is happening now is very much a mainstreaming of that discourse, a mainstreaming of aspects of that discourse. But it doesn't need to be normalized. That's what I'm trying to say, I suppose. Most of it doesn't need to be normalized. And I don't want to get too specific with examples, because an example from Greece comes to mind as well. But no, I agree with you entirely. And I think, as I said, we need both.
Who wants to ask something? The mic. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay. If I may be a bit provocative to generate discussion, you said that you started from, you're a specialist in the history of fascism in Europe, and you started from the position that fascism is an interwar European phenomenon. I'm not convinced that in general, but also from what you said, that there is the analytic validity to transport the term to now. And that probably it's more political, in terms of it's used, but it's not really, it's used because of political reasons. In terms of political discourse, some elements we could identify as still there, but not all of the elements. And on the other hand, the actual involvement of people is not there. We could not imagine having something like whatever the March on Rome in Italy today, not being possible, or the brown cells anywhere. So are we really legitimized to use the term fascism for something like the far right, or for, let's say, for parties which use an ideology, a political discourse, which has some elements similar to fascism, but which, I would claim definitely are not fascist parties, or this is not fascism, unless we were very loose in the terminology we use.
Thank you very much. Of course, it is a provocative question, and I sympathize, because, as I said, I went through that intellectual process myself. You're right, in the sense that the rhetorical power of the word fascism post-1945 is very important, and it's probably a very important part of this discussion. And initially, I, like you in that respect, resisted this kind of thing, because I said, I have no problem with people using it, but I don't want to use it because I have studied it in a particular way, in a sort of historically contextual way, therefore I wouldn't use it. What I would say, kind of reflecting my more recent thinking in that respect, is first of all, there's great that it has rhetorical power, so let's make the most of it. Why not? Number one. Number two, on the more epistemic level, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that fascism is part of a much broader genealogy, much broader, that predates it. It's a particular moment of alchemy, of a particular moment of historical synthesis that I call alchemical, because like an alchemy is base materials, but somehow when they come together they make gold. It's something like. But the materials are base. They're there. They're around. There's no big invention. There's no reinventing the wheel in that respect. So in that respect, even if, and this is a very legitimate position, fascism is a historical product of a particular society where mass mobilization meant going out in the streets and doing parades, and a kind of mass coup d'etat meant marching physically from one place, from A to B, to go and do this and so on and so forth. Even if that fascism has got very little resemblance as a mass movement to today, and nor will it, okay, we don't expect it. I think, beyond the rhetorical value of the term, which we park for the moment, I think that there are interesting and useful similarities, and not similarities that are contextual, as I said. So we don't need to play down the difference. We don't need to trivialize the term. I would propose that we need, on the one hand, to see fascism as something bigger. So at the end of the day, even historical fascism is not that unique. I mean, this is the thing. On the other hand, to say that if, let's say, for the sake of argument, we accept that fascism is a scavenger, as Moser was saying, fascism is an alchemist that takes up all these materials and kind of makes up something wow and historically specific and so on and so forth. A combination of those base materials can still be recombined in a particular way to produce a really radical outcome that we see in the post-war radical right, in the contemporary, in the new radical right, if you like, post-1980s, in the alt-right today, and so on and so forth. Of course, there will be no March on Rome. But I wouldn't expect any revival of fascism today to stage a March on Rome. That would be, that would be ahistorical in many ways. I mean, the March on Rome was a particular response to particular conditions of power struggles, okay? I think today the equivalent of a March on Rome would be swamping the internet. I don't know. I mean, something like this. Where is the public sphere? What does networking and mass mobilization mean today? But mass mobilization, it takes place in a completely different form. So I don't disagree with you. I still feel ambiguous about this extension of the term. But I appreciate its value to conjure up particular images on a discursive level, and on drawing attention to the fact that fascism, the historical fascism, does not begin and does not end, does not have a form, does not have a particular recipe book, does not have a particular blueprint that it follows. And it doesn't mean that as it goes through historical stages or from country to country, it should follow that book. I find the history of fascism a history of, back and now, or whatever, of translation after translation after translation. Part of what makes something appealing, okay, when we read something or when we hear something and everything, is your ability to connect with it one way or another. And when you connect with it, you refract it. And when you refract it, you change it. And when you change it, it becomes something slightly different to it. And I think fascism excels in this and still does. So I don't know. I mean, as I said, we don't really disagree in that respect. And myself from 2010 would probably agree wholeheartedly with you.
Who else would like to ask something? The mic too. Yeah. No.
Good evening. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Not that I agree with everything, but your approach opens new ways of understanding things, in my opinion. I have 3 or 4 things to say. Fascism was born as an answer to what happened in 1917 or in 1919, or maybe even back in 1905 in Russia. For them, what happened in the Soviet Union, it was later the Soviet Union, was an extreme. So the only way for them to reply was to be extreme, but on the other side. I don't agree labeling every, through the discussion before, everything as fascism. I think that Nazism is the core of what today we call fascism, and we shouldn't call it fascism. It's easy to label everyone fascism, and this makes, I think, the understanding of all these movements more difficult. Because when we talk to people in the streets or we're demonstrating, they say, oh, they're all bloody fascists. And there is no distinction between, let's say, groups on the ultra-right or on the right. And how can we deconstruct the way they think and behave? This is very important for me. I've studied public history. I have a master's in public history, and I see this every day. The way the ultra-right or the right, or even the other political parties or movements express themselves. And this is very important to understand the changes in discourse and in their behavior. The third point is I don't disagree with normalization. I think there is a normalization, and I think it has to do with the convergence of the neoliberals with the ultra-right or the right. This is something I think that people should spend more time on researching. There are powerful relations between affiliations between neoliberalism and what we call fascism or ultra-right. And one can go back to 1973 in Chile and find a lot of these interesting stories, and maybe it's, in 1973 is the source of what we are experiencing today. I will use something that has been used many times to end my question. Thank you for today. There's no march on Rome. We saw 2 marches, one by Trump's followers and one by Bolsonaro's. They are a caricature. I think we should be more, and I think this seminars here, these conversations, these discussions have helped us a lot in understanding a lot of things, how to change things. One more thing. the left has not recognized its defeat. The easiest way to change the world is to recognize that you have been defeated, and you have to understand the reasons why you have been defeated and change the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I made 6 questions here, but maybe I kind of so I may need to quickly ask you to clarify a couple of things. Fascism as response to 1917, absolutely. Without 1917, the whole Manichaean view of history that fascism puts forward doesn't make much sense. But it's interesting how it scoops up so many more things. Of course, the main enemy, not necessarily the immediate enemy as well, but the main enemy, the symbolic enemy as well is the left. One way or another, the revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, the communists, the internationalists, and so on and so forth. But by getting into this internationalism, by demonizing the internationalists who are the Bolsheviks, so on and so forth, as the main thing, then of course a number of other people come in. So anybody who is an enemy of the nation is an internationalist, in which case they come all together. But yes, take away 1917, or take away Bela Kun in Hungary, or take away the Bavarian Socialist Councils, or take away the Spartacist movement, I should have mentioned. You don't get, or the Biennio Rosso in Italy as well, you don't get the rise of fascism. You remove one of its fundamental reasons for being there on the level of reaction, but also on the level of discourse. I mean, the way in which the discourse of the Italian fascism changes after the Biennio Rosso in technically 1919, 1920, 21 though, in many ways, is amazing. Suddenly, the whole thing is shifting towards this kind of we crushed them. And this is the beginning of the whole thing. So I totally agree. I said earlier that I don't want to overextend the term. I mean, it would be interesting to know, to hear maybe at some point as we're finishing, how you, having worked on the sort of alt-right and so on, view the use of the term fascism in that respect. I am not a big fan of it. I am not. Absolutely not. On the sort of analytical level, on the sort of level of precision, you would not be surprised to hear that I don't think that, yes, of course, there are many differences between Nazism and pretty much everybody else. Yeah. Then again, Italian fascism up until 1938 was largely devoid of anti-Semitism, which made it quite unique in its own terms. And then again, the Ustaša fascist in Croatia had the highest ratio of clerical members than any other party. And then, of course, you have Slovakia during the war, which is essentially a clerical regime. You have Monsignor Tiso being the leader of the thing. So, yes, of course, there are differences. I don't think that Nazism is a different category in that respect. Differences important notwithstanding. Does that banalize, or I can't remember the exact term you used, overextend or trivialize or something like this, the term? I think not. At the end of the day, I don't care. And I'll tell you why I don't care. I'm being provocative. A lot of us historians of fascism study fascism, and when it comes to engaging with what lies a little bit beyond the boundary that we have drawn, conceptual, is not our problem. Okay? To me, some of the most interesting and untold stories of fascism are told about those grey zones. Are those grey zones, into inverted commas grey zones, where different ideologies coalesce, different elements get added or removed from the mixture, and so on and so forth. So if you remember that kind of illustration with the different symbols, we use this, but we're going to put this one and we're going to take away this or whatever. So I don't care that much about the conceptual purity of fascism. Or let me put it this way, I don't have to care that much because others before me have done the dirty job. So I don't need to reinvent the wheel every time. I can say I accept this more or less, yes, this is it, but at the same time, I would like to engage with the bigger picture. I would like to engage with dynamic, movable, intersecting, bleeding into each other categories. And that also includes transition across historical periods, especially, I suppose, if I am trying to make the point that fascism in itself is part of something much bigger, much more long-term, and much more resilient in that respect. I agree about the connection between fascism, you call it neoliberalism. Well, I mean, historically speaking, you can call it about liberalism. In fact, Lipset does make that point, okay? It does make that point. He's trying to draw attention to the connections in that respect. So, I agree with you. This is not something that is... You mentioned 1973. I don't even think that 1973 is a seminal moment, absolutely. And it kind of tells a different story that in many ways you can connect it genealogically to what's happening now. But on the other hand, I think this is something that was happening in many ways. Does the story need to be told? Absolutely. And again, it's a story that will allow us, maybe contrary to what you were saying, to connect the two stories of what's happening today with the radical right and what was happening historical with it. The March on Capital, you called it a farce, and I agree in some respects. Because it kind of looked like history repeating as a farce scenario. But the dynamics of the March on Capital were completely different, of course, to the March on Rome. It's something that was brewed in a non-geographically specific way. It was happening in a completely different public sphere. I'm not sure it was, as I said, I'm not sure it was entirely a farce. You may disagree. I think American democracy came very, very close. The American parliamentary system of sorts came very, very close to entering this sort of taboo territory that, of course, we want to believe that it would never do because of its resilience of its institutions. So, yeah. I'm not so sure, but I understand what you're trying to say in that respect. As for the defeat of the left, I mean, Stuart Hall makes that point about Gramsci. He says he encounters the devastating sense of the sort of socialist moment that never was. That, everything seemed to be going according to the prescribed order of things in the early 1920s, and of course it kind of didn't happen. And essentially his point is that it shouldn't be particularly surprising. I'm not, defeat. I don't know. I try to end with this slightly more positive note. I'm just saying, just to understand that it is an uneven battle in the respect that I was trying to say today. That it takes more effort to break that banal reproductions of so many things that are reproducing, whatever you want to call it, the fascisms or the alt-rights or the radical rights or whatever, and keeps reproducing them. And not just reproducing them because we're talking about elites and everything, but it's also making this kind of narratives far more familiar and far more reassuring and far more acceptable to people. But thank you, Yusuf. Probably didn't answer all of them, so sorry.
To ask something else. Anyone? Yeah. Yeah. So, my first thought was on what you said in the beginning, in one of your first points about the way that, conspiracy theories have been, one of the key features of fascism. So that the people feel roped and all this kind of sense triggers this kind of processes. But my question is that, to which extent do you think, because you said, about the Versailles Treaty and all this kind of, that there was at this point a material ground for fascism in 1919. But for example, nowadays, there is another material ground for this type of processes who triggers these processes. Like, for example, the void of democracy, on, how many of the processes of democratic legitimization have been, upgraded to the level of European Union. So there are some stuff in the material ground that are happening that trigger this type of processes of conspiracy. Of course, people don't have, the proper analytical tools to understand exactly what's happening, but there's something that's happening. It's not. So this is the one thing that I would like to ask. And secondly, is that in what you said is that, of course, fascism, it is not exactly a kind of unified thing. This is why, I think it's useful really to use the term, because it was something that was, happened or started in Italy, but took different forms through, in Europe. And I think the same diffusion of things and processes happening now. And if you don't like to be a philologist and, and in analytical terms to think, to focus on something, you should really focus on the political outcomes that this process. So, it's more, proper to see what historically is happening and how these things, are, taking place. And the last thing is that, of course, it is the banality of fascism that is happening, and this is one could, of course, and it is always easier to use the dominant ideology and to legitimize yourself. But the interesting thing about the case of Greece, in 2012 onwards, is that Golden Dawn, who of course is an exception, but and what the literature has argued is that solidified, its presence because of the use of violence. So violence was against immigrants, etc., made certain, group of people, social groups, to believe that this is, that some people do something. What they were doing, of course, is debatable, but violence is, a way to understand why sometimes, fascism finds grounds to legitimize itself. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the last point, actually, if that's okay. Of course, violence is an important part of the performance of Golden Dawn, of the performative aspects of Golden Dawn, is also part of what makes it spectacular, if you like, in the sense of kind of attracting attention and becoming like this. But I'm just quickly looking at my notes here. So yes, but is it enough? It's part of the explanation as to why people are, some people are attracted to it and may be willing to normalize it, to accept it, let alone to vote about this, although voting is only the very, very tip of the iceberg rather than just anything else. But why is that violence appealing? Because it's not appealing as violence. I mean, we may disagree on this one. I think violence is still, to use a term that I used earlier on, taboo. It's something that you need to justify to do, even if it's perpetrated against immigrants or all sort of others in one way or another. But it's something that you need to legitimize. I mean, the fascists spend a lot of time in words and so on, dressing up their violence, the violent praxis and the transgressive praxis in every sense, in all sorts of arguments that give them an ethical stance to it. So, action, yes. Action is something that I can see. So, fascism today, like the Golden Dawn that you mentioned as example, is the opposite of the ineffective, corrupt, useless state, for example. Okay? So I understand this. But there is violence and there is violence. And what makes one kind of violence more attractive than others? And in that respect, I think it's the underpinnings of it, that it's not just violence to protect a neighborhood. Generally, it's violence against immigrants, who I see as a threat to the Greek national identity, to the Greek peculiarity, to the Greek specificity, and so on and so forth, who have been invading the country. And then, of course, you latch on to the great replacement theories, and you latch on to Orban, and you latch on to all these things, and you create these things. So, it is important, absolutely, but the combination of the performativity, the openness, the sort of let's make it happen, but the nationalist ingredients that feed it and give it shape and give it meaning and give it a moral compass in the eyes of many people. That it's somehow, even if violence is taboo, even if it's not a good thing, what are we supposed to do against those people who have come to our country, and so on and so forth? So, and then all these narratives are rehearsed that are being reproduced in many ways. Focus on historical outcomes, not on words. I agree, but I would say again, I don't see either or. I don't think we should focus on words only. I don't think we should focus on discourse only, but, in that respect, I mean, is this a critique of the analysis of the contemporary far right as well? Or of the historical field that we know much better? Both. Well, I mean, now I could call on Ruth Vodak here. Discourse is a bridge, of course. It defines cognition, it defines the fields of action. We should focus on the outcomes. And I don't want, the last thing I want today is for anyone to go away saying that I banalize the outcomes, the extreme outcomes of fascism. Far from it. I'm not saying you're saying this, but this is not what I mean. I'm saying, in spite of all this, there is a banal infrastructure that's feeding and it's making it attractive and it's making it reassuring. I totally agree. The point about the material grounds, but this is a point about conspiracy theory, the idea of conspiracy. I agree. I mean, the sense of, presumably when you talk about European integration, you're talking about this sort of sense of loss of power?
Yes.
The notion of national power as a zero-sum game, okay, the sort of idea that somehow it's here or it's somewhere else, and if it goes somewhere else, then it's not here, or if others come in, then it's getting diluted and getting shared and everything, and that feeds into the conspiratorial mind, which is not paranoia. I mean, this is the thing. We tend to refer to conspiracy theories in that kind of paranoid way. It's not. It's sense-making process. It's an understandable process of condensing and distilling complexity. Some of it may be very, very difficult to understand. But it's interesting how the tropes of that conspiratorial thinking change from period to period and from country to country in that respect, and how the new elements get projected onto it. So, yes, I mean, I entirely agree. I don't know whether I captured the point about conspiracy theory correctly. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Who else wants to ask something? Yes, after 2 hours, I think we can. Yeah, it's time to say goodbye. Okay. Yes. So, thank you for your presence today. Thank you, Aristotle, for your great talk. And on 27th, we'll have Susan Robertson, and she will give a talk on the educational futures. It's 27th, right?
Yes, it is the 27th of January. So it's going to be a seminar on the current predicaments and future of higher education, the current neoliberalization of education. So we will wait for you here. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much, Aristotle, for this fascinating talk.